Good afternoon. It is a pleasure to be here today to present an overview of Australia. This presentation was made by Araiza Yora and myself, Paola Toro. Let me ask you a question. What is your first thought when you think about Australia? When people think about Australia, they often picture its stunning natural landscapes, from the Great Barrier Reef and the vast outback deserts to modern cities like Sydney and Melbourne. Others may think of kangaroos, surfing, or the laid back lifestyle that's often associated with Australians. But beyond these popular images, Australia is also a fascinating country, politically and culturally speaking. It's a constitutional monarchy, a federal democracy, and one of the world's most stable political systems. Today, we will go beyond the stereotypes and explore how Australia actually works as a nation, its origin, government structure, legal system, and the main branches of power that keep it functioning. Let's begin. Australia's human history begins tens of thousands of years ago with the First Nations peoples, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. They have lived continuously on the continent for at least 50,000 years. European contact began in the 17th century with Dutch and other explorers, but British colonization actually started in 1788 when the first fleet established a penal colony at Sydney Cove. Over the 19th century, the separate British colonies in the continent developed self governments. What happened later on January 1st of 1901? Well, those colonies federated and the Commonwealth of Australia was created on that date, uniting them under a federal constitution while remaining a dominion of the British Crown. This long history combines deep indigenous connection to land with later British settlement and modern multicultural immigration. How is the country organized? Australia is a federal country, as I have previously mentioned, which means it has two levels of constitutional authority. At the national level, there is one Australian constitution adopted in 1901, which created the Commonwealth of Australia and defines the powers of the federal government. This includes areas such as defense, foreign affairs, currency, and trade. At the state level, each of the six states, the ones you can see on screen: New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, South Australia, Western Australia, and Tasmania, have their own constitution, parliament, and government. These state constitutions give them control over internal matters or affairs, such as education, health, and transport. Together, these constitutions form the foundation of Australia's federal system. There, the powers are divided and shared between the national and state governments. An interesting fact is that the Australian Federal Constitution has only been amended 8 times since its creation. Australia's legal system is part of the common law tradition, which you probably already have heard of. This was inherited from Britain. That means law develops through statutes passed by Parliament and through decisions of judges, that is, case law. The Australian Constitution is a written document that sets out the federal framework and certain powers, while the High Court of Australia is the ultimate interpreter of the Constitution and the highest court of appeal. Over time, Australia has developed its own jurisprudence and legal institutions, but the common law heritage is still important or central to legal reasoning and procedure. How is power divided? Australia follows the doctrine of separation of powers in a parliamentary context, and this is key here to understand the division. The three nominal branches are the ones you can see on screen. First, we may talk about the legislature. There we have the parliament, which includes the crown, the House of Representatives, and the Senate. The other branch is the executive, with the prime minister and the ministers who are generally drawn from parliament. Lastly, we have the judiciary, with the courts, led by the High Court, as I mentioned earlier. Because Australia has a parliamentary government, the executive is formed from the parliamentary majority, meaning that there is an overlap between legislature and executive membership, unlike a strict presidential separation. This is similar to what happens in the United Kingdom. This means that the executive branch, which includes the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, is drawn from members of the Parliament, usually from the political party that has the majority in the House of Representatives. Because of that, that's why we have the overlap between the branches. In other words, the people who make the laws, the Parliament, are often the same people who carry them out, the government. This is different from a presidential system like in the United States, where the president and the Congress are completely separate. The president cannot be a member of Congress. This power division is established by the Constitution.
You may wonder, what are the core functions of each branch? Let's begin with the legislative branch. On this branch, we have the parliament. The parliament is responsible for making laws, debating national policies, approving public spending, and holding the government accountable. It is bicameral, meaning it has two houses. The House of Representatives, also known as the lower house, where the government is formed by the political party or coalition with a majority of seats. The second house, or the upper house, is the Senate, which reviews proposed laws and represents the interests of the states. Let's move on to the second branch, the executive. We have the Prime Minister, the Cabinet, and Public Service. The executive is in charge of putting laws into action and managing the daily operations of government. It proposes most legislation, implements programs and policies, and direct areas such as foreign affairs and national defense. Most ministers, including the prime minister, are also members of parliament, which creates a close connection between the legislative and executive branches. Lastly, the judiciary or judicial branch. These are the courts led by the High Court of Australia. The judiciary's main role is to interpret and apply the law, resolve disputes, and ensure that laws are consistent with the Constitution. The High Court of Australia is the highest court in the country and the final court of appeal, which I have already mentioned. Its decisions define the balance of power between the federal and state governments. Who is in charge? You probably already know the answer by now, but let me explain. The head of state is the monarch. Currently King Charles III, represented in Australia by the Governor General, who performs many ceremonial and constitutional functions on the monarch's behalf. This is a position that I had not heard of before. Currently, the Governor General is Sam Mustard, who you can see in the middle of the screen. The duties include giving royal assent to laws, commissioning the Prime Minister, and carrying out certain reserved powers in exceptional circumstances. The Governor General lives at the Government House in Canberra, also called Yarramullah. The head of the government is the Prime Minister, who is the leader of the party or coalition that holds the majority in the House of Representatives and who directs the executive government and cabinet. The current Prime Minister is Anthony Albanese. The Prime Minister and ministers are accountable to Parliament and ultimately to voters. Practically, the Governor General acts on the advice of the Prime Minister and Cabinet in most matters, while retaining a formal constitutional role.
Now, we're going to talk about the division of each branch of the government and who is the maximum authority of each one. We're going to examine the structure and leadership of each of the three branches of the government in Australia. First, let's talk about the legislative branch. At the federal level, Australia's parliament is bicameral. This means that it has two houses. First, the House of Representatives, and this represents the lower house, and the Senate, representing the upper house. According to the most recent figures, the House of Representatives has about 150 members. Meanwhile, the Senate has 76 senators, 12 from each of the six states, and two each from the mainland territories. I'm referring to the Australian Capital Territory and the Northern Territory. The highest authority in the legislative branch lies not in a single person, but in the Parliament as a whole. And this includes the Crown, represented by the Governor General, together with both houses. In other words, lawmaking authority ultimately resides in the Parliament. Now, let's talk about the executive branch. Formally, the executive branch is headed by the Governor General of Australia, representing the monarch's representative. But in practice, the real leadership is exercised by the Prime Minister of Australia, along with the Cabinet of Ministers. The maximum authority in the executive branch resides with the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, holding the confidence of Parliament and operating under the Governor General's formal power. Finally, let's talk about the judiciary branch. The judicial system is headed by the High Court of Australia, which is the highest judicial authority in the land. And it interprets the Constitution, resolves disputes between federal and state governments, and serves as the final court of appeal. Therefore, each branch has a different structure and has its own top authorities. For example, Parliament for legislature, a Prime Minister or Cabinet for executive, and High Court for judiciary. Now let's continue with the next part. Now, how do these branches interact? What texts exist? How is power separated or shared? Well, in Australia, the separation of powers is not strict in the sense of complete isolation of the branches. Rather, it functions within a parliamentary model derived from the Westminster system. For example, the executive branch is drawn from the legislature. The Prime Minister and ministers are members of Parliament, often of the House of Representatives. Meanwhile, the legislative branch makes laws, scrutinizes the executive through committees, question time, and debates, and can bring down a government through a vote of no confidence. And finally, the judiciary branch remains independent because the High Court can review laws and examine whether they are constitutionally valid. Now, let's examine in greater depth how the Prime Minister of Australia is chosen and how long they remain in office. Because although the process may at first glance appear straightforward, there are several constitutional, political, and conventional strands intertwined. First, in Australia, the Prime Minister is not elected directly by the voters. Instead, after a federal election for the House of Representatives, the leader of the political party or coalition that holds a majority of seats in the House of Representatives is invited by the Governor General of Australia to form government. Formally, the appointment comes from the Governor General, acting under the Crown's constitutional authority. Section 64 of the Australian Constitution provides that the Governor General may appoint ministers of state. Yet, there is a crucial convention because the Governor General will invite as Prime Minister the person who can command the confidence of the House of Representatives. That is, someone whose party or coalition can secure the support of the majority of members in the lower house. In practice, this means that either a single party has won a majority of seats and the leader of that party becomes prime minister, or in a hung parliament, the leader of a coalition or minority government that can maintain supply and confidence becomes prime minister. Importantly, there are no fixed term limits for the prime minister. They, they remain in office so long as they continue to enjoy the confidence of the House and they retain the leadership of their party or coalition. since internal party leadership changes can lead to a new prime minister from the same party. As a result, a prime minister's tenure is variable. While the House of Representatives has a maximum term of 3 years before a general election must be called, the Prime Minister could call an election earlier or be replaced midterm by their party or lose confidence and thereby lose office. Thus, the system blends democratic legitimacy through the House elections with parliamentary accountability. The Prime Minister's position is one of leadership within Parliament rather than a separate popular mandate as in presidential systems. And because of this, you'll find that in Australia, leadership transitions happen not only through elections, but also through internal party mechanisms. This arrangement fosters responsiveness because the government must perform in parliament and maintain internal unity to survive. Now let's move on to the next elections. Let's now look in detail at how the two chambers of the federal parliament are filled, focusing on election systems, term lengths, and the logic behind them. First, let's start with the House of Representatives. Members of the Parliament of Australia's lower house are directly elected by the people. Elections are held in single member electorates, often called divisions, with one member of the Parliament representing each electorate. Voters cast their ballot by preferential voting, and this is also known as instant runoff voting. They rank the candidates in order of preference. A candidate must secure an absolute majority, this means more than 50% of the vote after preferences to win. This system ensures that even if no candidate gets an outright majority on first preferences, the distribution of preferences will deliver a winner who has broad support. The maximum term of the House is 3 years from its first meeting. However, elections may be called earlier by the Prime Minister, with the Governor General's former dissolution. Thus, the lower house provides dynamic representation of the electorate, tied closely to changes in public sentiment. Now, let's move on to the second house. Now, let's talk about the second chamber, the Senate. The upper house uses a different electoral system. It employs proportional representation in multi member electorates, since the states are the electorates. This system allows smaller parties and independent candidates a realistic chance of winning seats, unlike majoritarian systems. State senators typically serve 6 year terms, with half the Senate elected every 3 years, or so called half Senate elections. Territory senators serve terms concurrent with the House, roughly 3 years, because the territories have different constitutional arrangements. This structure assures that the Senate remains more stable and less directly exposed to short term electoral swings, while still reflecting a broad range of political views. In summary, both chambers are democratically elected, but with different methods and with different logic. The House favors government formation and accountability. Meanwhile, the Senate favors review, stability, and representation of states and territories. Now, let's move on to our next part. Let's move on to the party system. Australia operates a multi party system. Thought historically, politics has been dominated by two major coalitions. The two principal groups are the Australian Labor Party, or also called ALP, and the Liberal National Coalition, that comprises the Liberal Party and the National Party, which act together as the main center right force. Smaller parties, for example, the Australian Greens and the Central Alliance, as well as a growing number of independent members, play a significant role, especially in the Senate, where proportional representation gives them influence. Since the Senate is structured for representation of broader political spectrum, minor parties and crossbenchers or independents can hold the balance of power, meaning that they may influence legislation, negotiation, and amendment of bills. This gives the Australian parliamentary system additional flexibility and pluralism beyond a strict two party paradigm. To sum up, while the government is often formed by a major party or coalition that gives the appearance of a two party dominance, in reality, it is a multi party governance, particularly in the upper house, fostering negotiation, coalition building, and diverse representation. Now, let's move on to the next part. Now, let's talk about the structure of the judiciary branch in Australia and who the maximum authority is. Turning to the judiciary branch, Australia features a dual court system, with federal courts coexisting alongside state and territory courts. And this reflects its federal and constitutional structure. At the apex lies the High Court of Australia, and the High Court of Australia serves as the final court of appeal for all federal, state, and territory courts. And it also serves as the constitutional court of the Commonwealth, interpreting the Australian Constitution and resolving disputes or issues between the states and the federal government. While each state and territory has its own Supreme Court, district or county court, and magistrates or local courts, the federal layer includes the Federal Court of Australia, the Family Court of Australia, and other specialist tribunals. Judges of federal courts are appointed by the Governor General on advice from the Prime Minister and Cabinet. Hence, the maximum judicial authority is vested in the Chief Justice of the High Court, who leads the High Court bench. This structure upholds judicial independence, rule of law, and serves as a vital check on both legislative and executive power, particularly via constitutional review. Now, let's move on to the next part. Now, let's talk about one of the main questions in here, that is, who gets to vote and when? Let's start with who gets to vote. Voting in Australia, federal elections is universal and compulsory for all Australian citizens aged 18 years and over. Citizens must enroll and vote. Failure to vote can result in a fine. However, the enforcement varies. This participation principle ensures broad civic legitimacy for the government and parliament. Now, let's talk about when to vote. At the federal level, the House of Representatives has a maximum term of 3 years from its first meeting, and the Governor General of Australia may dissolve the House earlier and call an election. The Senate serves 6 year terms with half of its seats up for election every 3 years, and these are called in half Senate elections. Territory senators typically have terms tied to the House. Elections for both chambers are often held simultaneously. These are called double dissolution. In fact, the system provides regular democratic renewal of the House, combined with greater continuity in the Senate. And all of this helps balance responsiveness with stability.
Well, That was all our presentation for today. I hope that you enjoyed it
Before
and
we end our
learned along the way
presentation,
with us.
we would like
Thank you.
to reflect on Australia's government.